Welcome everybody to this tutorial for how to use and apply socio-technical configuration or STCA analysis by choosing appropriate parameters of analysis and representation. STCA is a method to retrace configurations of social and technical elements from document SOCs, such as interview collections or transcripts, newspaper articles, or media posts. The method builds on insights and methods from event and social network analysis, and it was originally developed in the context of transition studies, but its application domain is way broader. But before continuing with it, I would like to say what are the conditions, for you to have perhaps a benefit from listening to this talk. You should really have a sort of a solid basic understanding of how the method works, how you can apply it. And for this, I refer you to the guidebook, which is on the website to the right side, where there's a step-by-step description of how to apply the method really and what it is in the first place, alongside with some other resources like this tutorial, but also other YouTube videos that explain the details of the analysis. So for this particular talk, it would be really useful to have an own case, and you having played around with the method already a bit and wondering about how to set certain parameters to come to meaningful networks and insights. So the main aim of this presentation is that I want to provide you a solid intuition for choosing the parameters for constructing one-mode networks, and what are the considerations about how to aggregate, how far to aggregate, or how fine-grained to treat nodes or codes about nodes, time periods, etc. And whether, what the advantages are of one-mode representation versus other forms of representation. So the slides are also available on the website, and just as a technical hint, the references that I will do to the coding relate to my coding in the Max QDA software, but in principle, it's coding can be done in any software, and the network visualizations are executed in Visone software. So what will the talk be about? I will first introduce you to an illustrative case about a leading industrial region that's confronted with a transition, a socio-technical transition, and how this developed over time. And I will choose this or do that in a very particular form of selection of parameters, and then stepwise question or vary, certain key elements that will have an impact on how the data look like. So it will be about choosing the similarity measures, about layout, configurations, aggregations of actors and concepts or time slices, then also short digression into dynamics and animations, and a final point will about the advantage or the specific strength of a one-mode representation compared to two-mode or frequency plot analysis of the same data. And then I will wrap up with one slide. So the case that I will report on, or that I use as an illustration, builds on a paper which was written by Hui-Ben Gong and myself about a globally leading industrial region in a specific sector, and how they can cope with, or they do cope with challenges that come from socio-technical transitions. So there's specific cases about the German federal state of Baden-Württemberg, who is a global leading region in the global automobile industry, and had to embrace in the last 10 years the emergence of the electric car, and we can retrace sort of the struggles that were implied with this transition. So the specific STCA part of the argument builds on retracing the regional engagement of the different actors with the problem as reported in newspaper articles between 2010 and 2023. And in a nutshell, we can characterize the development in sort of an emotional cycle, if you want. First started by a denial of the relevance of the topic, then a phase of experimentation, and finally acceptance and endorsement. So the specific database that we constructed built on newspaper articles that are stored in Nexis Uni database, with a search term that built on the future automobile electric cars, sort of a combination of all of that. That resulted in 170 articles, mostly from Stuttgarter Zeitung, but in principle open to any newspaper. And we ended up with 21 actor codes and 36 concept notes, which were attributed to about 800 text segments. Just as a side note, the codes that we attributed, the concept notes, were relating both to substantive and discursive codes, as we distinguish in the guidebook. More details. So the coding tree that resulted, and that's here you have to just be attentive a bit to the color code because it will come back in the networks. So the pink colors normally relate to statements and actions that are supportive to the internal combustion engine trajectory, whereas the red ones are more in favor of the electromobility trajectory. The yellow ones are about policy support that's required or that's actually executed. The blue ones relate to all sorts of industrial structures in the region, also like imaginaries or visions about the future, etc. The orange nodes will be about labor market questions, and the green nodes will be about all sorts of infrastructures, and in particular also technological innovation activities that happened in the region in that period. I will in the following focus all on how to construct one-mode concept networks. So, bear with me with these color codes. But, underlying, we also have, of course, the coding of the actors, which we also put into several categories. So we had political parties, we had the automobile industry, suppliers, academic research, government, and then what we called other companies or actors, which were user citizens, industry associations, trade unions, and so on. So with this color code, we can just, I can just in a nutshell tell you the three phases of denial, experimentation, and acceptance. But before doing that, I would just want to point you here to this sideline that I have put up, which is a sort of a code for the specific parameter setting that led to this presentation. So OMC means one-mode concept networks in the period from 2010 to 2014. And it was done with a centralized radial layout, a cosine distance calculation for the similarities, and a backbone filter of 0.4. That means like all the links that were smaller than 0.4 or the CSV values that were smaller than 0.4 were just deleted to have a sort of neater picture. So here you see the first period from 10 to 14 as a one-mode concept network. And what you see immediately is that in the middle, you have a code that is called EM is a relevant option, which means a sort of a lukewarm support of saying, yeah, we have to engage ourselves with the electromobility topic, which before was sort of always denied to have any relevance for the region. But it was strongly connection, as you see, to these sort of purple nodes, which are supportive to the internal combustion engine, which would say, well, the internal combustion engines will never disappear. The electromobility niche is weak anyways, and the ICE will be the dominant future also anyways. What you also see is there's a lot of reference to the yellow nodes, which refer to policy support. And of course, the coverage, the news coverage was a lot about national policy or regional policy. It has to do a lot to tackle the challenges that are around here. The blue and the green nodes, which refer to the more regional structures and innovation activities, they're sort of splintered all across the field and don't have a very clear pattern. So if you want to summarize this picture, you could say, well, the electromobility will come somehow, but there's lots of buts, and that probably will not be too bad for the region. The second period, now we see it's from 15 to 19. All the other parameters are the same. We see that the picture has changed quite dramatically. So we see lots of the red dots or nodes, which are now a new one, which is the electromobility will be the dominant future even, and the Dieselgate, which was sort of the challenge that happened together with the increasing market success of Tesla, and where actors had to take this option of electromobility much more seriously. There's still some talk about the IC remaining dominant, but the other purple nodes have moved to the periphery, and the green nodes with specific activities and investments like manufacturing, infrastructure investment, battery development have become much stronger. So if we want to summarize the second period, the experimentation, we could say, well, the regional actors endorsed an understanding of we have to take this electromobility really seriously. We cannot deny it anymore. So moving to the last period from 2010 to 2020 to 23, you see that the picture has changed another time. And now electromobility has been endorsed much more clearly. In the core, you have now all these green and blue bubbles. That is really sort of, we have to get active and engage with electromobility. And statements about the IC being the dominant future have moved very far to the periphery. Also that the electromobility niche is still weak, have a sort of a marginal position, etc. So we would say that this is really an endorsement that electromobility will be the future. So that's in a nutshell the development, the story that we have told and that we can present. And now you may ask, well, there's all sorts of decisions on how to present, how to characterize and categorize the data and present the networks. And if we would have chosen other parameters, would the storyline change in any fundamental way? So in other terms, how robust is this representation of the storyline? And that's, it's not the main part of my talk, where I will just lead you through the impacts or implications if you have chosen different similarity measures, so the principal Shakar and cosine. We would have chosen different layout options like stress minimized versus centralized radial. What is the impact of aggregating actors or concepts? What is about the time slicing, the dynamics and animation, and the one-mode representation to start with. So here you see again the first period in the same presentation as before. And if you would now, and this was based on the cosine distance. Cosine distance means we have taken the frequencies of our original coding, where the actors and the concepts are cross-tabulated, and we take the number of times each actor has been associated with this particular concept as the basis for calculating the similarity between the concepts here. So then you get this sort of picture. If you would have had, you would not have taken the frequency of the table, but just identified 0 or 1s, whether an actor had at all been connected to a concept, then you would apply the Shakar similarity procedure, and you would get a picture like that. So at first glance, the two are quite similar. You see that the red electromobility is a relevant option is still somewhat in the middle, less so, admittedly, but the overall distribution of nodes is similar. But if you want to take it very, to the core, you would say, well, here, this picture is sort of neater. It has a more smoother presentation of a center periphery gradient compared to this here, which is much more strongly oriented at different components, as we call them. So strongly interconnected elements that have sort of a logic on their own. So in a nutshell, you could say, well, this is that's what you get. If you're more interested in having a sort of a view on the field as a whole, then probably the cosine similarity is more appropriate. If you are in a situation where probably you have competing configurations, then Shakar similarity is probably more appropriate. I would say it's always good to, at least at first, check for the two representations, so you can just make an informed decision about where to go with that. A second core parameter to choose is whether you go in the representation or the graphical representation of the data, you go for a centralized radial representation or rather a stress minimized. So to the left, again, you have the same first period. And if you now compare this to a stress minimized layout, you see that that is again much more messy. It takes much more time to analyze and see the relationships between nodes. And we will not go into the details, but just in a nutshell, what you see here in the stress minimized layout, you see the components much more clearly. So here's a cluster of nodes that are strongly interconnected and that deal with, well, the electromobility being a relevant option. There is need for new demonstration clusters activities, but the IC will not disappear, and the electromobility niche is still weak. And, you know, there's a self-understanding of Baden-Württemberg being the cradle of the automobile. So this sort of summarizes very nicely the defensive stance in this first period. And of course, you have the same information also here, but the interconnection between the nodes gets a bit blurred by the too many intersections that crowd the center of the graph. You have a second one component that's also sort of neatly identifiable, which is much more about investments into electric car development, institutional change, charging infrastructure, international competition, the future mobility imaginary. So this represents more activities around the innovation, the proactive engagement. So let's say at the lower level, you have sort of more the defensive line of argument. At the upper part, you have more the proactive engagement with the topic. So the question of which one is the better one, again, it depends on what you want. So for our case, it was really, we wanted to have a sort of a view on how the field as such has developed. So we opted for the central radial layout, but this can always be a bit treacherous because, you know, nodes get overlaid in many different forms and you might just interpret patterns in a wrong sense, which means that they're not really actually interconnected. So the stress minimized layout is sort of much stronger in that. You can just retrace much more easily how nodes are interconnected. So I would always advise that if you go for the centralized radial presentation, also have a solid look at the stress minimized layout and check for interpretations for their robustness. Okay, so this is sort of the core when you do STCA network representation, one network representations. And now another question is, you know, what is the appropriate level of aggregation of your codes? As you see to the right-hand side, you know, my coding tree had sort of different levels. And so what you saw in the networks was just the lowest level of aggregation, all the codes that are at the lowest level. But perhaps it might make sense to, you know, you don't need so much details. You could also aggregate the pictures. And that's what I have been doing here. So the first one was just to only aggregate the concepts, but leaving the actors still in their original coding or the most fine-grained coding. So what you see over time, this is the first period, the second period, the third period, and you see that the basic pattern remains the same. So there's not a different sort of storyline that comes out. But of course, you know, the codes are more aggregated, so you see less detail, so you have less view or less understanding of how exactly the topic electromobility is the future, which is here in the middle for 2 periods and over here, what this consists of and whether how much variety there was within that code. But the big picture of having this electromobility is the future with a lot of support needed, and then, you know, the struggle with the ICA Raymond's dominant versus the electromobility is the future. And then in the last period, the focus on infrastructures and batteries, that picture is still robust. If you do the same with the actors, and here I only have one, the original phase, the first phase for the actors aggregated and the concepts still left in their original form. So what you see here is that, you know, it's still sort of the same picture, but the picture is much more crowded. So you have here the center that's just overpopulated, and you don't see much of a structure anymore. And this means also that that's because, you know, the actors are sort of aggregated in high chunks. You have a lot of variety that gets crisscrossed by this aggregation. And at least in our case, this would be less advisable, let's say, than aggregating among the concepts. So if you do both together, so you get something like this, which is again very similar to the concepts only aggregated, and you see again sort of the same patterns. So what is the best level of aggregation? Again, it depends on your specific requirements, your research question. What do you want to see? You know, how far are you interested in rather detailed sort of arguments or storylines that made a difference from one period to the next? Or are you more interested in conveying the big transformation process, and then a higher level of aggregation might be appropriate? So let's now move to the next level, or another important topic, of course, of aggregation, and that's the time slicing. So that's very important if you have these comparative static slices that you compare. And then, of course, it's important that you find periods that are sort of coherent in terms of the phenomenon, which means that sort of similar sort of processes were happening within the period, and there were sort of major shifts between the periods. And so the best argument is always if you have a priori ideas about what an appropriate slicing would be. Like in our case, it was the Dieselgate, which really disrupted the logics, you know, the discussions in the region. And then the arrival of COVID was then like perhaps a second one. But it's always also good to really check in some more detail and see if you have shorter time slices, does the storyline then change, or at least do you get more detailed information about the processes that happened, which would be too aggregated if you have more as a larger time periods to analyze. So here the first one is, let's say, the original first period, but extending until 2015. And you see more or less the same kind of pattern here with EM being a relevant option and all the other arguments as we've seen. But you have here an additional component, which is about the Dieselgate, which was just breaking in 2015. And so you see here as sort of a transition phenomenon with a new component that emerges. So still it would be a good argument to cut the period before 2015 as we did. But you know, here you see it quite nicely how the added information will change the network structure. On the other hand side, if you then take 2016 to 23, so you get a sort of a blurred image of all sorts of nodes that are not really, you know, connected in an identifiable way. So I would say that the big message is there's a lot of infrastructure investment and innovation activity, but you cannot read much more out of that. So this would really be a case of too high level of aggregation where you don't see much of a development anymore. Of course, you know, there has to be some real world developments to trace, but as we know there has been a development, we would say, well, this representation is probably not very adequate to the phenomenon. We can push this even one step further and just make one network for the whole period. And then, interestingly enough, the phenomenon sort of gets a sort of a different picture. So we see something different here, qualitatively different. And this is like more like topical clusters. So we see that all the green nodes are on the upper part of the plot, and the blue nodes are rather in the lower one. We see the supportive ICE elements clustering in one corner, the EM supportive in another, and the policy parts in another. So it looks like, at least over the stretch of this whole process, if you aggregate everything, you see more of the positioning of actors or the activity of actors in different topics, which would also be sort of natural, you know, than any sort of competing, connecting interactions between the storylines. But this is an interesting phenomenon as such that when you aggregate more and more, the object or the problem that you represent suddenly starts to shift shape and tells you a different story in a way. Of course, you can also go the other way around and then make smaller time slices. So here I had like 5 periods instead of 3. And the first 2 are just splitting up the originally first period. And here what you see is that, the EM as a relevant option is still in the middle, but then all the others are sort of circularly oriented around this. And you could say this is about like the electromobility topic has been launched. So it was in the center of the newspaper coverage, but there was not much of a structure. In the second half of the first period, we see then that there's a first start of innovation activities, labor market activities are coming up, etc. So the confluence of these two then, constitutes like the first phase that I showed you originally. So here the labor markets innovations were coming up. Then the period of 2015 and 17 was sort of the changing point, the U-turn of the storyline, where suddenly you see that the red nodes with the support that are supportive to electromobility are in the center together with some infrastructure investment topics, and autonomous cars was very hot in that period. You also see that the Dieselgate has become, of course, quite important, and also the statement about the transition really being needed, whereas the pink nodes are moving more to the periphery. And so we see really a sort of a fundamental shift in the structure. So ICE will not do is sort of the topic here. Then from 18 to 2000, we see that this whole part of the green nodes gets more strong over time. And then finally, the last period from 21 to 23, which is really sort of, the coverage has sort of settled in on electromobility just having to be implemented now. There's no fundamental question anymore really in it. So what we see here, of course, is that the more fine-grained we get in the time slicing, the more details we see. And the question is then, what is sort of the optimal level of details, how fine-grained you want to retrace it. And again, that depends very much on what you're after, what you would like to see. Sometimes, also the data structure is good enough to really retrace rather fine-grained processes. Whereas in other cases, you're just happy to see a sort of a categorization over time, a periodization, and illustrate that. Perhaps one note, how far can you go in the disaggregation? And so what we observed is, the same that happens when you aggregate to the top, that suddenly the phenomenon shifts its shape. Also happens when you go finer and finer. So if you have very short time periods, so here, for instance, would be 1 year time periods, then suddenly the networks become a bit haphazard. So the process is not stable anymore that they describe, and it becomes very difficult to interpret anything. And the same is also true if you would go for the actor codes, if you would identify individual actors, we had here quite categories of actors, then things might get sort of haywire and you don't see much of a constant, a red thread through the storyline anymore. So there is this whole aggregation topic. There is sort of an optimal level of aggregation, but you will have to find out a bit for your own research question and your problem that you want to tackle, which one it is. So that's the constructive part. And to be on the safe side, it's always good to play around a bit with these things to say, yeah, actually what I want to see is quite robust across different settings of parameters. And, my nice storyline just doesn't depend on setting the parameters in exactly a specific way. And if I change that a little bit, my whole storyline blows apart. Okay, so of course, now we had this sort of comparative static time slices. You can, of course, go a step further and try to retrace the dynamics in the system. And so what I did here was sort of moving time windows for 4 years duration. And also here you have the situation from 2010 to 13. And unfortunately, I have to make you aware that I changed in between the color code, which is unfortunate, but it would be too much effort to change it again. So now the green nodes are the supportive for electromobility, the red ones are supportive for ICE, the yellow ones are still the same, and the blue ones as well. And now it's sort of this undefined color elements that are referring to infrastructures and innovation. Otherwise, everything remains the same. So if you have the first 4 years from 10 to 13, this looks very much like the first period that I showed you originally. If you go then from 11 to 14, you see that things are changing a bit, and the network is developing sort of a more incremental way. Things are appearing like the Dieselgate here suddenly, and you can then retrace the developments, which I will not comment now in any details, but you have a sort of a smoother transformation from the original to the end. This might be interesting to really see, when certain elements have been emerging and when sort of fundamental reconfigurations have happened. Of course, these networks are also not so stable to have very smooth transformations, but it can still be very interesting to follow up the dynamics in much detail. And then you can even go one step further, and Visone offers you an option to develop. Let me just to have sort of dynamics. So here you see it, so you can just do movies about the network development where you also see the individual elements developing. And I have here also the same 4 years moving time windows. And when you start it, you see how over time the different elements have moved in their configuration. You can perhaps focus on the green elements and the red elements and how they changed over time. It stopped playing, so now it's running. So you see which sort of new nodes came in. You also see how the new connections were sort of formed and where old connections disappeared. And again, it's because it's a stress minimized layout, you have to really follow the different elements in much detail to see what is really happening. But that can be sort of an interesting complement to the time slices that I showed you before, the moving time windows, where you can see how the elements moved around. In particular, you see that the ICE will remain dominant future, remains in the realm of the center for a very long time, and only towards the very end, it then starts to move out the periphery of the coverage. You see here the cradle of the imaginary and the IC dominant future that go to the periphery, and then in the last period they just go extraterrestrial. So that's what it is about the dynamics. So that's also what we saw for the aggregation problems, and let's say also in particular the dynamics, the time slicing, etc. So I would now just move to another topic, which is why should we even look at one mode networks, and what's the added value of that? Could we not do it much simpler with frequency plots? And of course you can do that, and it might even be advisable to do it as a sort of a counter check to see how the phenomenon looks like if you go in a more straightforward and not a configurational approach, but just to look at frequencies. And that's what I did here. So I had to aggregate a bit the codes and the actors, which you see below. The color codes relate to actors. And here's sort of the big topical areas like the support for internal combustion, the support for electromobility, the regional innovation systems, labor market, infrastructure and management. And if you look at the distributions within these, you will see that in the first period from 10 to 14, the green bars, which are the odd car companies, have a strong frequency of statements and actions that are supportive to the internal combustion engine, much more so than for the electromobility part. And the regional innovation system codes are also addressed by all sorts of actors, in particular also government actors and the car industry. Labor markets coming up, infrastructure and management are not very strong. So in the second phase, you see a shift in this pattern. ICE gets lower and electromobility gets higher, and the labor market becomes very strong. And also we see infrastructure management is sort of increasing, manufacturing management. And in the last phase, there's a strong emphasis on infrastructure and manufacturing, and the actors are different ones. So it's now a lot more about other companies than the car companies, etc. So if you want, this is the same storyline. Of course, it's the same data, so it's robust. Our interpretation is robust also in this way of presenting it. The advantage here is, of course, that you have the direct link between the actors and the concepts. So you see in which sort of topics the car companies have been active, and that's what you typically don't see anymore in a one-mode network. So, but in between, you have a sort of an alternative to look at both at the same time. So to have a bit of the configurational flavor and also still look at the direct connections between actors and concepts. And that's the so-called two-mode concepts networks. A two-mode network is actually nothing more than just a graphical depiction of the original database with actors and concepts. And depending on the strength of how many times an actor has been associated with the concept, you will have a thicker line or a thinner line. So you can here see for the first period again that electromobility being a relevant option has been a core concept that was referred to by the Baden-Württemberg government and also Daimler Chrysler as the main car company. You also see that the Baden-Württemberg government was very interested in having joint regional innovation system development, was arguing in favor of sustainable transport, was supporting a new future mobility perspective, and was also very eager to support research programs and startups. Whereas Daimler was more busy with arguing about charging industries, car sharing, saying, oh, we're already sustainable because we do car sharing. We are under international competition, etc. So you see here for the first period, that is sort of depicting the position of actors directly with the concepts. And so a two-mode concept network can just give you additional information that would be lacking if you only looked at the one-mode network. Of course, you can also combine the two, and that's what several people have done over the years. And so you can have the one-mode networks, here it's aggregated, so to have a sort of a one-to-one connection, but you could also do it for a more disaggregated variant. And then you say, well, here are the actors and the concepts, and you provide also the frequency plot for this particular presentation. And then you can switch back and forth and interbreed a bit who is contributing to, let's say, IC remains dominant, probably comes from the car companies much more than from other actors and these sort of things. Okay, so that's about it. So let me just wrap up the whole task. So these have been, I would say, the major design parameters that you have to consider when you do STCA. And you have to play around a bit to find the best representation of your data. But as you also saw that if you have a sort of a good coding tree, then things cannot go haywire. So your choices will not distort the storyline all too much. But on the other hand side, before making strong statements about the core message, you should also try other parameters to check whether things really remain robust. So to wrap up, it's just that coding is, of course, all the art where all the art is. If you have a not so well elaborated coding tree, then also your networks will not look very convincing. And so there is a lot of work to do in the coding and to have clear concepts and that are well balanced, etc. And you can have no parameter settings that will compensate for weaknesses in the coding. So that's a sort of a very clear starting point for everything. Then for the layout parameters, so stress minimization versus central radial. So you have to look at both as the short of it. So that the central radial integrates better, and this stress minimization shows the storylines better. So you have to choose. Cosine similarity represents the field better, and shock R highlights the components better. Again, depending on what you're interested, you would rather go, let's say, for a combination of stress minimized with shock R. If the components are in your interest, and rather for central radial with cosine if the field structure is more of in your interest. For the aggregation, we saw that concepts provide sort of meaningful aggregations, at least in my case here, and while actors tended to blur the pictures. As for the time windows, of course, there's sort of a golden middle way between too big and too small. And of course, it's always important to have additional arguments why a certain periodization has been chosen, which is perhaps not in the coded text, but from your other knowledge of the phenomenon. And for two-mode representations, as I said, it shows the actual relations between actors and concepts, but you can also combine the one-mode networks with frequencies and as substitutes to have the same information. So overall, just do some sensitivity analysis. That's always recommendable. And the best choice of parameters cannot be decided a priori, but has to be found out for the specific case. Okay, with that, I hope you will have a lot of fun, playing around with the different parameters and the networks and trying to make sense of them. I would want to conclude here by thanking for Alexia Dubuis, who just supported me a lot in this whole data gymnastics that are behind these different representations. And if anything, you want to go deeper into that and have a closer look, also you will find the slides and other resources on the website, as I said. So thanks a lot for listening, and hope to hear from your research in due time. Best regards.